Just started the stream.
Okay, do we have any notion of how many people are likely to want to testify there?
At this time, it looks like we have two attendees. We have Mr. Noble from the Department of Revenue and Mr. Mullen. Started the stream.
Okay. To me, the sort of plan for the day is we're going to hear from the House folks as to what they did going through and explaining their bill. I'm expecting that Matt Wilmarth from LSO will give us some details on what, not only what's in the House bill, but on some of the restraints that the federal government has given us with this stimulus money and some of the details there. And that's going to be very important because they passed that. I know we had our bill on the floor of the Senate, I think on second reading when they passed their stimulus. So it was not at all informed by what the feds had done. The House had the benefit of some information on what the feds had done, but the staff, both our staff and Superintendent Bailos have been telling me they're continually finding new things. And there's a number of places where the federal guidance is on a to be announced basis. So we've got to accommodate what we do to that. Of effort and other requirements are getting to affect well over a majority of our budget because of not only the education and higher education stuff, but the health stuff as well. And that raises some special concerns where the state's at risk of losing total control of its budget and its taxation. So that's the background. We're trying to make sense out of what's in education, and any insights y'all have and how it affected what you did would be very important. And then we'll, after we've heard that, we'll go to public testimony. There doesn't seem to be an excessive amount of that, which is just as well, because I was trying to make precautions if we ran out of time to come back and hear it at noontime, and I can't get a quorum on the committee, so we can't do that. So we're not planning to work the bill at all today. We're planning to try to understand it and work it on Monday, I hope. Get it entirely done on Monday. So with that, Representative Summers, you're on.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and committee, thank you. And I bring you House Bill 173 engrossed and ask for your favorable consideration. And so, Mr. Chairman, I am just going to give a very high level of where we were. So remember, we had a recalibration this last interim, and out of that interim came House Bill 61, which basically had two things in it: the option for a tax, and it had some reductions for K-12. As we got to the House, we were looking at that and said, you know, there's probably a three-legged stool if we look at what diversions we have and whether some of those diversions should go to the school foundation program. And I think some of that was informed, Mr. Chairman, so this high-level stuff was really informed by a UW survey. And that UW survey basically said, we don't want to cut education and we don't want to be taxed. Well, there's a tough conundrum there. But what was clear in that survey as well was that they wanted to spend savings before they got taxed. And so that informed how we looked at creating 173. And so that's why we pulled in some diversions. And so in this bill, you're going to see some of the 1% severance, the statutory 1% severance, a third of it going to the SFP. You're going to see half of the LISRA refuel, which is the investment income portion, a portion of the investment income off of our permanent mineral trust fund. And then you're going to see a 0.5 cent sales tax. It started with a penny, But once we got those federal dollars in place, I think the body decided we'll reduce that to a half. And so you'll see a half penny sales tax, but it's really an insurance policy out there once the LISRA drops or the rainy day fund drops below 650 million. And the whole idea behind that was, once again, the people of Wyoming basically say, let's use some of our savings and before we have a tax. And so we have kind of an insurance policy on our rainy day fund. And then we had some reductions, and we debated all kinds of reductions. And we debated all of that in recalibration. And clearly, in my mind anyway, the most defensible reduction you can make in the K-12 funding model is reimbursable health insurance. And so in this, you'll see that phased in over 3 years. That's, we hope, clearly below the level of our maintenance of effort. So we'll have our maintenance of effort for our federal dollars. And then obviously the fourth leg of the stool came in with the federal dollars kind of late, and that kind of informed the rest of the discussion. So that's the high level is really we have well, it's really a five-legged stool, because we have our backstop for education, LISRA. We have some diversions that can take some of the pressure off that LISRA. We have some reductions that can take some pressure off. And then out there, if our LISRA drops, we have a tax. You know, and the only thing I would ask the good chair and the good committee is, you know, you try to keep all of those pieces in place, maybe in different proportions when you go to the floor. I think what this is a great debate on education funding. It's really our opportunity, and for the state, to hear this whole full debate. And what we shake out with, whether we shake out, it maybe at this point isn't as important as this debate in the state. And so I encourage this body to think about keeping all pieces in some way, shape, or form as you go to the body and have that debate. We had 30-some amendments on the floor of the House on this. And so it was indeed a great debate, Chairman, and that's really all the time I'm going to take of yours.
Okay. Let me, before I throw it open to the committee, let me comment on a few things. My guess is that we're probably going to remove, as a committee amendment, the sales tax provision. There's concerns. I think there's a majority of the Senate that is opposed to any tax increase until we've gotten the education spending better under control. I think that's a majority position. What I'm tempted to do to make sure we have a full dialogue on that is to myself bring that back as a second reading amendment so we can get a roll call vote. So we'll get people firmly on the record on that. I'm playing with that idea. And I don't know whether you guys have any opinion on that or not, but I think that might be useful in terms of going forward. The diversions we have, you've dealt with our appropriations committee, you know how they feel about that. That is probably going to be controversial. That may be a matter of we wind up negotiating in the long run. The Senate opposition to the sales tax, I think, is twofold. One is just the substance of a tax increase, really threefold: substance of a tax increase, feeling that we shouldn't ought to do it until we have the spending under control, and the third one being overt concern that this is unconstitutionally two subjects in the same bill and violates that provision of the Wyoming Constitution. And that's a concern that I share. I was instructed long ago in my legislative career that we had to be especially careful about tax bills, that they were likely to be litigated in that the two-thirds provision, the two-subject provision in our Constitution might be very literally interpreted if you put a tax bill in with something else. So we've got that set of problems there, but it may be useful to take it and get a recorded vote in the Senate on that subject. certainly we will try to bring the whole thing and explain as best we can what you did and why. And you're looking at it as an insurance policy. Is that a good way to express it?
It is. And Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the fact if you bring that as an amendment, at least I think that is generous of you to do that. And it doesn't have to be a recorded vote in my mind, but the fact that you would do that and let the body debate it, I think is worthy. So I appreciate that.
They will debate it in committee of the whole as part of a standing committee amendment. But I think it might be worth having a public record on it. And I have in the past on controversial bills done that sort of thing. When we dealt Medicaid expansion one of the first times, we took precautions. It came out of committee with a do not pass, and we took precautions to guarantee a floor debate and a floor vote on it. And some of these fundamental issues, I think that's good policy. So I'm not certain that that's what I want to do, but I'm playing with the idea and mentioning it this time because I kind of want feedback on it from the House members, but from the committee itself. It's clearly an issue we need to grapple with. I would also remark that I've gone through this bill myself now, seen what you did, and I would be very complimentary of the work of the House on this. And particularly Speaker Barlow's amendment gets us started in thinking about how in the heck are we going to deal with what the feds have just passed us. Talking with some of Superintendent Barlow's people, they say in a number of areas, the guidance that are going to be very important in how we deal with the federal things. The guidance they're getting is that the guidance is to be determined and no time frame. And reading the underlying law, it is more than a little complicated. So that's going to be a difficult proposition. Committee, any questions for the House members? Seeing Mr. Speaker, you want to say a few words, particularly give us some insight in the amendment you brought, because it looks to me like a very good starting point in terms of how we deal with what the feds have passed to us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I do appreciate the opportunity. The amendment, actually, I'd say all of 173 was just handing you the toolbox, handing the Senate the toolbox. Obviously, you can't initiate a tax on your side, so to have that discussion, it has to come from the House. So all of the different components, and I would. So that's the first thing on the tax. The second thing, the diversions, as you said, let's have that conversation about what we're willing to do. The federal dollars, your point is well taken. Mr. Wilmarth, our fiscal staff, they're studying it, looking at it, trying to sort it out too. And we'll get more guidance, and hopefully we leave ourselves enough latitude so the way the bill is structured, the superintendent can make the appropriate decisions when we do know. I do think it is important in this particular context with the federal dollars, because those go directly out, that we have some structure to try to capture the value of them, or what value we can. Obviously, the bill doesn't try to capture all of them. We're leaving 20% for the districts to utilize as they need, and changing their spending reserves, moving the reserves up, so it gives them some flexibility going forward as well. So hopefully we've given you, it's certainly our effort with the good chairman of recalibration, the chairman of revenue, and Representative Simpson on our side did a lot of work within the model. The other thing, you have the entire model at your disposal too in this bill, the entire model.
Yeah.
So I think hopefully you have every tool in the toolbox and you can sculpt, and then we'll come together and hopefully we'll have a good product to work for. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
While I've got the three of you here, let me just speculate aloud a little bit on some of the things and maybe get your reactions to them. And I do find with the circumstance we're in this year, with still recovering from the COVID and not having some of the events we normally do where we talk to the other house, it's been a more difficult situation than normal. It seems to me that we need to build on a number of the things you've given us, and we need to take some additional precautions. I'm thinking that in making sure, when you look at the requirements that the feds have put on the school districts, they are voluminous, and there's some real limitations on what they can spend on what. I think we need to structure what they do, probably require that they put all the federal money in a special account so we can trace what they really spent. Because I thought the governor's guidance on the first stimulus was very wise in terms of, we've got to be careful how we spend that federal money, because if we get hit after the fact with an audit from the feds, which we're likely to, and we can't show we spent it well and in accordance with their guidelines, we could be in a world of hurt. So I think that may be a requirement you would see in here. And we're talking with the superintendent's office as to how we can structure that sort of a thing. I think that the notion of reserves, I think we ought to preserve the increase that the House made in the reserves, and maybe expand on that concept a bit. I think you've set us down the right road, and as we understand better what we can and can't do, that may be a key to going forward. Because I'll tell you, what scares me is staring at the cliff, which is unpredictable, where we spend the LISRA down to where we can't use it anymore. The information I have, and I'm going to ask the LSO when they're up here to talk about a little bit what happens under those circumstances. But my understanding is that the current statutory scheme is that we can't use the LISRA anymore. We can't use some of the other funds, and the result is about a 30% reduction to what we can send out to the school districts. That would be catastrophic, and I think would lead to both nasty service cuts and nasty tax increases that would get the whole population mad, not just part of it, and do considerable damage. So I think preserving things so we can deal with that is important. And we may look for how we can structure that in this, building on the idea that you've started us down in the reserves. And in the spending, I think by selecting the insurance where it's not being used as an appropriate part of the model to adjust, that makes a lot of sense to me. One of the things we could do is raise the class size a bit, and then in the model, increase the funding for the teachers to make up for that. So it didn't impinge on our maintenance of effort, but made the model a bit more realistic. That's a possibility, and I'd invite feedback across the board on the various things there.
So, Mr. Chairman, we've debated all of those, right? That was in the bill, out of the bill, in the bill, out of the bill. So, you know, in the end, we chose the one we did because certainly it is the most constitutional. Once you decide that you're going to pick and choose among the various components, then you have all those decisions of what's constitutional and what's not constitutional. The health insurance thing during the interim with the consultants on a public mic, I asked them if the health insurance as reimbursable, did they believe that that was a constitutional reduction? And they said they did. So once you start, as we have debated all of these little components, you understand the complexities. So we have had those debates in the House side.
Yeah, if we did something for the teachers, we would have to do it because, as my understanding is, the insurance reduction basically takes up most of the leeway we have with the feds in terms of meeting their maintenance of effort requirements. And we would use the Barlow Amendment to take us the last step of the way to meeting that fully, so that we can conserve the state money for when we're going to need it real bad. I think it works in terms of dealing with the federal requirements. Used on a grand scale, I would think it might invite some court difficulties locally. But I think we can make very good use of it to get us down to the limits that the Fed set. But give priority to the insurance reduction. And that's thinking out loud. So I'm doing it partly to see what reaction I get.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, so going into the components, and you have every component in this bill, first 40-some pages of the bill have every component. You mentioned the class size, teacher salary, et cetera. You can certainly, I think the thing that we found on the House side, and certainly we did, was also during recalibration, was that when you started tweaking in the model, it affects every district differently. So when you start running those numbers about what happens to Fremont 2, 4, 6, Sheridan 2, 1, 2, 7, whatever, then you start seeing where some districts may take a 10% cut and some may get a raise of 2%. You start seeing how it impacts different sizes of districts, and different districts very differently because of their structure, et cetera. So when you start getting into the components, we did all through the recalibration and even on the floor of the House. And then you start looking at it, how it impacts different districts. It can be quite profound. And then you get into maintenance of effort issues, and that potentially could get there, So anyway, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that. Thank you.
I would speculate, and we haven't paid as much attention to impacts on individual districts in the Senate as I think you have. I would think that the insurance one was fairly well spread among several districts. Would it not be?
It's cool. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your thoughts on this. The three of us served on the recal. I think Senator Rothfuss. I don't know if anyone else here, but that's the part you struggle with, and that's the part you struggle with is these. And so we really came down to this equity issue, and this insurance piece affects people differently. And I tell you, Campbell County is one of the hardest hit because I think for a lot of different reasons, but I think maybe spouses, we theorize, maybe have insurance for his coal mine in their household. And so, but I think the idea is to phase that in over 3 years so districts can change behavior. And, and then, the ACA at 30 hours or the state plan at 20 hours and all those things play into that. So I think as that rolls out.
I'm told there's even a little double counting in there, or for some reason, some employees get on the rolls for insurance twice. And of course, they only take it once. That seems to be a quirk in the local accounting system. And I don't think that's a major portion of it.
Mr. Chairman, but
I was told that did happen, but it's minor.
Yeah, and I think back to all these components and these tools that the good speaker talked about. In the end, we had to do kind of what you're going to have to do is what's doable. This was the one that could pass the House, and I think, we haven't taken any money from the LSRA yet for education. We've been saved every October, Craig, and we might very well be saved this October, Craig. We're going to leave town and grow the LSRA by 200 million and got 130 million in ops done. We fully funded the 5% statutory reserve, and that's not even counting capital gains. And I think, and what's happened to natural gas prices and oil over the last couple months, it's been really encouraging. And So I know, and I'll just tell you, probably one of my biggest regrets, because I probably could have stopped it. And I talked to former President Perkins about this. Last spring, not a single oil well in the state. First time in statehood, because as you know, in my neck of the woods, we were drilling for oil before statehood. And price was -30. And I think, those talks we had were like, hey, we got to get started now to cut this 2-year budget, makes it easier. And I think it scared the crap out of a lot of people. $1.5 billion deficit. Well, we know that's not the case. And I think frankly, it affected elections. I think we lost some House members because of it in very close races. I think it scared a lot of Wyomingites. And I'll just say this COVID thing, and I say this with a lot of empathy, it's affected everybody's families. But as far as some businesses, they haven't all been losers. We know that. And we know that from tax rolls in different counties. So there's been a weirdness to this, but as we come out of this with some real hope to this, I think our numbers are going to change dramatically. And then the last thing I'd say is our demographics. And I talked to this committee about that with the Wyoming's tomorrow. We're going to start seeing less kids in the system. My school district's down 400 kids, millions of dollars. And you're going to see that in every district around the state. There'll be a few grow. I think this county will keep growing. But I think, so there's a lot of moving parts to this. And I guess I won't go into, I appreciate all your comments. I think on the constitutional part of having a tax, we worked that hard. Both sides, the House and the Senate, when we brought that original bill, your Senate members and House members are recal. But I think, we're like every other state, Mr. Chairman. We fund our schools with property taxes. And as you know, minerals pay 50% of the property taxes. The other big chunk of school funding is federal mineral royalties. We had our school CapCon fund balanced, and then a coal mine moved off of a school section, affected the royalties. It's that dependent. And so when you look at the Department of Health, about 20% dependent on minerals. Corrections about 30 or 40%. Don Richards can tell you all these numbers, but the highest, most dependent government service on minerals is K-12 education. So, and I'll just wrap this up. This is my version of a filibuster, Mr. Chairman, but I think it's important to kind of, so how are you going to pay for this? Because we're going to have to pay for it. And if we kick this can down the road, this is probably the last chance to get some meaningful reductions. And I just think, I just think what's the end game on this? And I think if it's, as we, every problem solvable. And man, I think in the end, people I've talked to, they said, please don't raise my property taxes. We don't have income taxes. And the only third way to tax is sales tax. And we're a sales tax state. We're 44th out of 46 jurisdictions. We have the fewest services. Everybody down our end saying, hey, let's be like South Dakota. Well, they tax 152 services. We tax 66. And we have the most exemptions. So, and 10% of the sales tax paid by out-of-staters, 5 to 15% by minerals. Currently, it's about 5% because we haven't had as much activity. But so that's part of the discussion. And so what we brought you, I don't know, Mr. Speaker can tell you, and the majority floor leader, they're into this business of counting noses, but it was what was doable. That's what we could pass, or we wouldn't have brought you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Ruffles.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I did want to start off by thanking the House. I watched a lot of this debate, and I appreciate the diligence and the thoroughness. A lot of work went into this, and honestly, this is probably the most constitutional draft that I've seen in the process, including the things that we were working on in the recalibration committee. This is, I don't know whether it's constitutional for sure, but it looks closer than anything else. I mean, when you look at it through all of the lenses, when you look at it from an equity standpoint, I don't see any clear violations of equity. When you look at it through the cost-based analysis, there are no clear violations of cost basis. There are some reductions, but again, the way the reductions are augmented, certainly through the federal funding and then backed by the LISRA and then backed by sales tax, seems like it's maintaining a cost basis. There's ECA analysis that goes into it. So really seems at least in the ballpark of cost basis, which is great. And then I don't see any violations of an evidence-based a la carte menu approach where we're going to make some cuts just because those are the things we don't like. And so again, first phase, I think we're in a constitutional ballpark, and I appreciate the fact that so much work went into it. And honestly, I appreciate the fact that after it seemed like about 1,000 amendments, if I'm not mistaken, if I counted those right, that the House looked at, to end up passing somewhere on the order of half of those and then end up with something that actually was within the realm of the Constitution seems like at least a minor miracle. So good work on that. But the thing that I really appreciate about this approach is the fact that it's trying to work with a Swiss Army knife, a 5-part approach, which brings in existing revenue streams redirected, the potential for new revenue, but not right away, which I do think assuages some concerns, maintaining the backstop for the LISRA, some cuts, but also the reliance on the federal funds. And we've talked about the federal funds as if somehow they're a liability because they bring strings to them. Just imagine how hard this process would be if we didn't have those federal funds coming, over $300 million that are being infused to help to keep education whole for the next few years while we sort this out. So I just want to make it clear that, I see that as a blessing. It probably gets us to the point where we've got a good education system for a few more years at a minimum. I don't see those strings as necessarily a liability. And in fact, when you read through the overarching legislation of the ARP Act, the strings that are attached to it don't appear that onerous. They're pretty broad. If you're focused on improving K-12 education and maintain your maintenance of effort, I don't know how you're going to end up going crossways with what we see there. But I know that we'll have more analysis, and Mr. Richards and Mr. Wilmarth are certainly in on that game as well as anybody can be. Getting to the future, though, as we look at how this will play out, I don't know if there has been time, and maybe this is a question for Mr. Wilmarth and Mr. Richards, if we've sort of plotted the projection out, because recall in recalibration, we sort of had, this is what the next few years will look like for our budget and the school foundation program based on reasonable assumptions. And we kind of had that mapped out, and then we had different scenarios in place. I'm curious if we have a calendar-based, maybe next 5, I guess we'd probably want like 3 biennia or something like that. The look at how this is likely to play out based on our current Craig projections. Have we seen that yet or produced that, or is that something that we still need to kind of contemplate and work on so we can see what this would look like? Seeing how the funds flow, seeing when LISRA gets hit, seeing potentially when a tax would be kicked in based on what we have.
And let's warn the LSO, you're going to get asked the same question.
True story.
Mr. Chairman, so I'll take Senator Rothfuss's question. So we do have some preliminary numbers. I don't know that they're out 5-6 years. We certainly went to the 3-year mark, and they've given us some on the diversions particularly, because that's something of interest that we can. So those numbers. Now, obviously, the bill is fresh enough, just engrossed. We're just got our talking points together. We're going to post them on the legislative website by the end of the day. And some of those numbers will be included in that, but certainly they'll be at your disposal. And I know our staff is working on them at our request, because we want to know too, not that these ideas are new, but this combination of ideas is relatively new in the engrossed copy. And so having that to you, and they'll be able to provide some of those, I think fairly, they can probably provide them to you right now, but it's not in a spreadsheet like you're asking for. And it probably doesn't go out as far as you want to in time. But let's also be clear, the biggest driver of the cost of education is the number of students. So we also have to keep track of that. And what the good chairman of revenue said is, 400 students, 1,000 students. I mean, the biggest tragedy for the state of Wyoming is we lose 5, 6, 10,000 students in the next 6 years. might help our education budget, but I don't know if it's good for Wyoming.
That's, again, good for education.
So anyway, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I think the numbers are available. They'll get put in a form that you can probably have by the time you go to the floor, and maybe they have them already, but I think you will get some of that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Mr.
I
Chairman.
would just add to that discussion, I think one thing we have to keep in mind is there's just tremendous uncertainty into where our mineral industry is going in the current environment. And so you got to take any projections with a grain of salt because of that. Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Senator Rothfuss, I thought about it, but staff didn't have the time. So the question is, and we did in recal, we ran long-term profiles. So we have a long-term profile now that everybody sees on our website. And certainly this could be thrown into that set of projections and you can run a long-term profile on it. I think it'd be instructive, but it's obviously just that. It's a long-term projection. So you never know.
Mr. Chairman, and I, the problem with, after about 3 years, your investment revenue runs out because of Craig forecast, only forecast really about half of what happens. And then your reserve accounts. So you create a paper deficit of hundreds of millions of dollars after about year 3. That generally doesn't happen. So I think that's just a caution and to all of us looking out too far.
Mr. Chairman, on that. And
Yeah.
with that, on recal, I know we were looking at scenarios where we were filling our spas, and I think that's the instructive thing for us to probably do. I mean, we know that we have nearly $2 billion worth of unrealized capital gains right now, for example, and we were probably sitting in pretty good shape to be filling the spas in the near future. As the chairman points out, we're in a good situation right now, obviously, with West Texas Intermediary crude at about $60 a barrel. Hopefully that will continue to go up. We're one of the few states that wants the gas price at the pump high, and everyone else complains about it. But whenever that gas price goes up, education gets funding. So hopefully we'll be able to maintain where we're at right now. We'll get back to drilling because at $60 a barrel, we know that we can be profitable in the state of Wyoming, but it is going to be reliant on some scenarios. And as the revenue chairman pointed out, since K-12 education is so heavily dependent upon the mineral sector, more so, it does get to the point where we have to start contemplating diversity in sales taxes, at least to some degree, orthogonal to minerals, as you pointed out, 5 to 15%. So I appreciate the fact that the backstop is not more of the same. Even if it's not necessarily the perfect backstop, it's at least a different backstop, which is good. So again, thanks for that. But we'll look for those projections and certainly share them with you. And I know that we'll be working more on that. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I didn't get a chance to listen to the debate on the House side, but on the tax issue, one ongoing concern I've had are the switch on and the switch off for when the implementation of a sales tax would come in. And so, as a business, if they want to invest in Wyoming, I think my concern with this is you want to know what your regulatory climate is, what your tax structure is. And so if you're a business wanting to move here, like this is really uncertain. I mean, we might never get there. We might get there. I mean, it just seems so uncertain. So what was the discussion on the House about if you want this revenue, why not just pick a date and say, we're going to do it? Because I've never seen this. I haven't seen this in any other state. And I don't know if any other state's done this. I'm unaware of any other part of our statute where we have on and off switches for taxes. I find that really concerning. So that's one question I have. And then the second is, and this is kind of maybe more of a mundane question, but one that I thought was really encouraging was in section 6. It talks about a consolidation study of districts. As you know, in Wyoming, we have 48 for our 23 counties. So I think that this is an important conversation because we hear it a lot from our constituents. Do we really need 48 districts? But looking at the mechanics of how you have it structured, it would be the State Board of Education who would conduct the study. My understanding is they've got a pretty monumental task underway this year to do a profile of a graduate. And so looking at the date of when the study would be due would be October 30th, 2021. I just don't know that they have the bandwidth or time to do that. So I was wondering what the discussion was. And along those lines, I wonder about just the objectivity. Why wouldn't like our state budget office or somebody who isn't maybe so invested in knowing the personalities and things of the districts, kind of take a step back and coordinate with other agencies, our Department of Revenue, our Department of Ed, but just a little thought of why you selected the State Board of Education, who I feel like is overtasked already right now with their work.
Mr. Chairman, on that first part, I would, I won't talk about our number of school districts in consolidation. That's a bloodbath that I don't want to, I mean, that's an easy one for me in Natrona County to talk about because we have one county district probably with Albany and Campbell County too. But man, you get outside of there, it gets tough. And I get it. I've talked about that for a long time as well. But as far as the sales tax on and off, so we kind of look back, back in the late 90s when we had a 3% state sales tax and we just had to raise it to 4%, but we raised it temporarily. And it was going to go off in a couple of years. Came back, raised it again for a couple of years. Then it's going to go off in a couple of years. And then finally, the third time said, this is permanent. And so we looked at, what are the right numbers? Well, we're like the only state that doesn't borrow money to cash flow government, right? So and that's about $500 million in the LSRA is what I'm told we need to just keep these accounts going back and forth. And, again, we're the only state that has been blessed enough to do that. It's really an incredible setup we have. So that's about 500. And so we picked this 650 before you get there, obviously. And then, to kind of, because there's other needs in government too for the LSRA. And then, but what if the boom times come back? That's what people always say, put this tax on us and then coal comes back, oil comes back. And so then 1250 was, well, looking at our current state, that's probably if the boom comes on, the tax comes off, and then the bus comes back. We probably got another 3 years figured out, drawn from the LSRA to fund schools. And so that's really why, I mean, it wasn't, and as far as, the business friendly thing, we have so many exemptions, like data centers. They don't pay any sales tax. Doesn't matter if it's 10%. Manufacturing equipment. All those things that are important for startup costs. There's no doubt about it. But some of those key ones for us, other than energy companies, they certainly pay it. But we have a lot of exemptions as well. So I get it. But the other part of that is it's only a half penny, and we're still way lower than anybody around us or anybody in the country. And so it's really a bargain to come here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A follow-up, because I want to be clear on this point. It's not so much that I object conceptually to what you're trying to talk about, but I think the examples you mentioned in the past where the legislature said we're going to add a penny and they were going to do it by July 1st, whatever the date. And then when they decided to repeal, they said we're going to repeal it or reduce it July 1st, whatever the year that was. And so there was certainty for the taxpayer to plan around that. That's, I think, my concern with this is it just kind of leaves it up in the air to market forces. And this is one area that I think that we probably should discuss more as a legislature is, we've heard about the amount that we need in the LSRA to serve for cash flow, but we profile it as part of our rainy day fund. And I know people don't like that term, but the LSRA, however you want to call it. So why don't we have a separate $500, this is our cash flow pot of money. And then when we start understanding what our rainy day fund is, then that's more of an actual number. So that's kind of the question, but it's more just the picking of the date of when something's going to happen that a business, and that's what I'm talking about, is their planning ability, not so much the amount. Is there certainty of, should I buy my equipment now before the LSRA dips below a certain level, or should I buy it later when, that's the part of it I don't like. And so, Mr. Chairman, your thoughts on that? I just want to be clear. That's my concern with it is these switches.
Well, Mr. Chairman, and I think, and it's a good question. I think though, when can you ask people to pay another half penny for education? When you have, I just don't think you can ask anybody when you have $1 billion in savings and you're going to grow it by 200 million on July 1st. I just don't think you can ask that. And so now it's not the time to ask. I think people say, hey, we've spent down our rainy day fund. We've turned every knob we can. Okay, I'll crack open another half penny for my local school. And if the boom comes back, okay, great. I'll get that penny off. It's not forever because government, once they stick you with the tax, they never take it off. I mean, and so that's what we were trying, that's the dynamic in the House. We were trying to work to bring you a bill, frankly. So it's not perfect, but I think, Abraham Lincoln, nothing is wholly evil or wholly good. It's a mixture of all. And
Quick follow-up on that.
Okay, quick, because we're.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, if the good senator wants to put a date certain on it, hard, fast time, I'll join her on that amendment.
Okay. Committee? Okay, thank you all very much. Appreciate, I think it's useful to have this dialogue between the houses. And I do, once again, want to compliment you on the quality of the product you sent us. Okay. LSO staff, Mr. Wellmarth, Mr. Richards, come on up and tell us what we're up against here.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Matt Wilmarth, LSO, School Finance Analyst. I'll plan to just walk you briefly through the bill, just so you have a familiarity with it and answer any questions the committee has. This is familiar with both House Bill 61 that we walked through earlier in the session, and also with Senate File 143. Pages 2 through 48 are the existing school year 2021 funding model components. They are being codified into law. And you'll see in section 3, we repeal, or section 4, we repeal attachment A and make conforming amendments throughout the bill on that reference. So I don't anticipate going through pages 1 through 48 unless a committee member wants to discuss a specific component. So what I'll do is I'll take you to page 49, if that's okay, Mr. Chairman. Correct. Mr. Chairman, and to that point, one important point is we run the numbers on what's the net reductions or net increases, et cetera. Again, the important point is this is codifying school year 2021, which sustains the ECA that was adopted by the legislature last year. Under the current law in the budget bill, that ECA is reduced by half. And so this sustains that ECA. And so that's why some of the numbers, when you net out on the golden rod or the fiscal profile, why you may see a component reduce a certain amount, it doesn't net out to that amount. So Mr. Chairman, on page 49, this begins the First Amendment in section 2 to the permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund investment earnings. As the representatives have indicated, the investment earnings on the PMTF are diverted, a portion of those are diverted to the school foundation program account. So on lines 17 through 20, anything in excess of 2.5% of the spending policy amount up to the, or 2.5% up to the spending policy amount is split now 25% to the school foundation program account, 25% to the LSRA, and 50% to the SIPA. So the SIPA stays the same. Really, you're impacting the LSRA portion by 25%. To put numbers to that, if that were to occur, if investment earnings exceed the 2.5% and up to the spending policy amount for fiscal year 22, that's approximately $49.5 million, $45 million for fiscal year 23, and $41 million for fiscal year 24 to the school foundation program account.
Mr. Wilmarth, or Mr. Chairman?
Yeah.
Would now be an appropriate time to ask a question about the impact of some other legislation that would alter this? I want to make sure the public's aware of that interplay.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wilmarth, I think in our discussions about this bill, you talked about some other pieces of legislation that would trump these provisions if enacted. And so I just want to make sure that the public and committee members are aware of that nuance.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Richards can comment on this. My understanding is Senate File 121 impacts the distribution of this investment earnings after fiscal year 22. And so the SIPA portion goes away. And I believe the full amount would go to the LSRA after 2.5%. So there's a provision in Senate File 121 that if any other conflicting provisions are enacted, Senate File 121 prevails. And so it's just something to be aware that multiple bills are amending multiple sections of law.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 50, this is one of the first conforming amendments where we're removing attachment A in reference in 21.2.204. We're just replacing that with the created section of 21.13.309.1. On page 51, there is an amendment from the House that modified the percentage of a student who counts as a full ADM on lines 1 through 4. Current law has that at 80%, and that is reduced down to 75%. The fiscal impact on that is minimal, but this alleviates some concern for some students who may be enrolled in that 5% threshold that would not be counted as a full-time ADM. Mr. Chairman.
Senator Office.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And I don't know if, maybe I just need to look into this a little bit more, but that one surprised me because if anything, that costs slightly more. This is something that we worked on a number of years ago and upped it to 80 at that point, I think, or actually changed it once temporarily too. What's the purpose? Do you have any more insight, or should I just go ask sponsors on that one? I see Speaker Harshman was willing to weigh in there.
Okay.
We must be trying to take care of something.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, you know, it used to be 50%. And then 5 years ago, we just said 80. And so what really happens on the ground, most of our high schools are 4-period blocks. So if a kid wants to take a period off to go to work or to go to seminary across the street, so what districts have had to do then to maintain that 80% so that kid could go work or go to seminary or whatever is work some kind of homeroom in or some other kind of deal to take instruction away from the rest of the periods, 10 minutes off of each period to make a homeroom so they can get to 80%. I mean, so districts will adjust behavior, but I think, is that what we want them to do? Necessarily to take time away from every block to create another little block. And so that's really it.
Nuanced block schedule. Got it.
It is very little money, but I think if any money. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, do we know a number? I think in my, my notes on the bill, I think I put not a lot of money, but do we have a sense of what that number is?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ellis, I would have to defer that to school districts. I don't know how to quantify that. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. On staying on page 51, lines 14 through 23, again, that's just a conforming amendment of the repealing of attachment A. Same on page 53 and page 53 on line 6. On page 53 on line 11, this is the health insurance component within statute. This is the one component that was modified as discussed earlier. Subdivision 3 on lines 22 through 23, and then going on to page 54, lines 1 through 14. This is the codification of the calculation to provide the health insurance premium to the lesser of the actual employees and partaking in a health insurance plan within a district, or the model generated FTEs. On page 54 and then going on to page 55 and 56, subdivisions 4, 5, and 6 are created to provide an additional amount to school districts for school years 21-22 and 22-23. And as discussed earlier, this is phased in where 2/3 of that reduction is provided in school year 2021-22, and then 1/3 of the reduction is provided in school year 22-23. If you want to discuss the calculations, I can in detail, but really what's happening in the subdivisions is you take that base amount, you subtract it as if all of them receive the premium amount. That difference is multiplied by 2/3 in school year 2021, 22, and then 1/3 in 22-23. So that calculation ends on page 57, line 14. And I'll draw your attention, you can see on 57, line 13, that 1/3 is provided for school year 22-23. The same 2/3 is on page 56, line 7. Okay, Mr. Chairman, on page 57, line 16, subsection O, again, this is a conforming amendment to eliminate the reference of attachment A. And then same on page 58 in subsection U, elimination of attachment A. On page 58, line 10, and then page 59, line 3 and 21 is just a technical correction to eliminate interim out of the joint appropriations name. Same on page 60, line 1. On page 60, this amendment to 21-13-313 is the increase of the beginning of the language to increase cash reserves from 15% to 30% of the prior year foundation program guarantee. The amendments on page 1011 is the acceptance or the accept provision where we increase later on. And then on lines 21, going on to page 61, line 2, we exclusively account for the Federal American Rescue Plan Act funds and require districts to separately account for those, and they are not included in this calculation until they've been completely expended. Mr. Chairman, on page 60, lines 21. Yes, page 60, lines 21 through 23, and then on the top of page 61, lines 1 and 2. The Federal American Rescue Plan Act funds shall be separately accounted for and excluded under this calculation. It's my understanding districts will likely account for these in a special revenue fund, which wouldn't account in their operating balance. But if they were to account for these funds in their general fund, we would still exclude them from this calculation.
This require the districts to put the federal funds in a separate account.
Mr. Chairman, it would require them to separately account for them. So that could be either within their general fund or within a special revenue fund. In the Department of Education, the districts do that with the majority of their federal funds. They separately account for those expenditures.
Yeah, we were talking with that, when we talked to Superintendent Balo and her people, that that wouldn't be very much needed, so we could demonstrate compliance with the federal. So we may modify that to make that a little stronger, but the principle is already in the bill here. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, on page 62, lines 7 through 22, and then on page 63, lines 1 and 2, this is the language that is being amended in subsection E to increase the reserve allowance from 15% to 30% of the total foundation program amount in the preceding fiscal year. That's on lines 11 and 11, 12, and 13. There is a provision that the additional 15%, so 15 to 30%, has to be separately accounted for, and those amounts are cannot be expended for purposes of capital construction, and that language is on lines 15 through 21. Mr. Chairman, going to page 63, Wyoming Statute 3914-801, subsection B is being amended. This is the severance tax provision, the additional 1% severance tax. In paragraph 5 on lines 15 or 16 through 19, this is the 2/3 of that amount will be provided to the 1% severance tax account in fiscal year 22. After fiscal year 22, 2/3 would be deposited within the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund. And then on lines 21, 22, paragraph 6 is created to provide 1/3 of that amount to be distributed to the school foundation program account. In terms of numbers, 1/3 of that amount is 22 million. So that would be the amount going to the school foundation program account for fiscal year 22, and slightly more, 23 million in fiscal year 23, and an estimated 25 million in fiscal year 24. Mr. Chairman, finally, the last provision of revenue relates to the 1.5% sales and use tax. Page 64 is the sales tax language. As Senator Ellis indicated, on line 15 and then on line 21 are the triggers on and off. If the LSRA balance is less than $650 million, this tax would be imposed. Once imposed, if the LSRA balance exceeds $1.2 billion, it turns off. And that's a 3-month period on either side. On page 65, again, just conforming amendments on the distribution of this 1.5% to the school foundation program account in subsection R on lines 11 through 13. And then on lines 15 through 23, and then going on to page 66 and 67 is the use tax, the additional 1.5% on the use tax. And again, the distribution is the same, and the triggers on and off are the same. Mr. Chairman, on page 67, lines 8 through 10, section 3 repeals 2113-101A and 2113-309M VC. This is just conforming amendments to the education resource block grant model. And then the repealer of 3914-801 subsection B paragraphs 1 through 4 is related to the severance tax distributions that have been amended throughout time. This just repeals those as they are no longer necessary. Section 4 relates to session laws and the creation of the attachment A's that are being repealed and the amendments to those. And then on section 5, this is the language that Mr. Richards is here for to help address any questions on the American Rescue Plan Act. This requires the state superintendent for school years 2021, 21, 22, and 22, 23 to reduce a school district's school foundation program amount in a proportion that maintains the state's maintenance of effort and maintenance and equity requirements under that act, and adjust the school district's entitlement and recapture payments accordingly. As Speaker Barlow indicated, the total amount that would be reduced is 80% of the total amount that school districts that the state would receive under that act. As we've indicated, the estimated amount to be awarded to Wyoming is approximately $303 million. School districts under that act are to be to receive not less than 90% of that amount, so approximately $270 million. And so 80% of the total award is approximately $243 million. Mr. Chairman, I'll stop there if the committee has any questions related to that mechanism of reducing a school district's foundation program amount.
So this would then take the foundation program amount down to the maintenance of effort requirements. Is that right?
Mr. Chairman, that is correct. Okay, Mr. Chairman, just to wrap up here, Section 6, as Senator Ellis indicated, is a study required of the State Board of Education on the reorganization of schools to be reported to the Joint Education Interim Committee October 30th of 2021. Section 7 is another amendment from the House that in it requires a report from the state superintendent to report to the legislature on any employee that has been involuntarily laid off between January 1st, 2021 and ending September 30th of 2021. And then, Mr. Chairman, on page 71, section 8 is the effective dates. Sections 5 and 8 are effective immediately. That allows the superintendent to make any necessary reductions this school year if possible, and then going forward. So with that, Mr. Chairman, happy to address any questions.
Seeing none, Don, do you have some information for us on what the feds have done to us this time?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. The $303 million, as Mr. Wilmarth indicated, does come with strings attached to them, both at the state level as well as the local education agency level, which is the school district. We have both maintenance of effort as well as maintenance of equity requirements at the state level that must be considered. This is not a new concept. Under the CARES Act, the same pot of money, which is called the ESSER funds, or elementary and secondary emergency funding, also had maintenance of efforts requirements when that bill was passed last spring of 2020. However, the maintenance of effort in that legislation was an absolute dollar value. Wyoming had, or at least had no concerns about meeting that absolute dollar value. And a wide latitude was given to states in terms of calculating that, either on a per ADM basis or on an absolute state support basis. In the maintenance of effort that is provided for in this legislation, it uses fiscal year 2017, 2018, and 2019 as an average. And then it states that the proportionate reductions to K-12, and by the way, the same application is required of higher education, community colleges and university, that the average reduction for education entities cannot be worse off than the general reductions to state agencies. The language of that maintenance of effort leaves a number of questions as to what is state spending defined as. Is it an appropriation level? Is it an expenditure level? What numbers are in the denominator? Is it just general funds? Is it general funds and other funds? Is it general funds, other funds, and school foundation program funds? There are some explicit limitations. We know that it doesn't include capital construction, for example. In our read of that, we determine major maintenance to be part of operations, not capital construction, but that's not defined by the federal government. What is somewhat concerning is that we could not identify any rules, regulations, or formal guidance in the 2002 CARES Act determination. Rather, the Federal Department of Education had a frequently asked questions website and a fairly simple form for states to, one-page form, for states to fill out to determine whether or not they met their maintenance of effort. Our concern is that any forthcoming guidance, which is undetermined, may not provide a suitable or a satisfying response to the definitions of all of these. One last comment I would add, and that is, at least in the CARES Act maintenance of effort, one concern is that calculation is done after the fact, not before the funds are spent. It is a look-back maintenance of effort to see whether or not the state actually maintained that. That's concerning because the sanctions for violating the maintenance of effort, there is a waiver process, and you can appeal to the Federal Department of Education to receive a waiver. But at least in the CARES Act maintenance of effort calculation, it was scheduled for 2021 after those funds had been expended. Using very, and I'll wait to be asked, I guess, about what we calculate. Mr. Chairman, this is considerably rough. As I mentioned, we don't know the definitions here. But we believe there's on the order of $45 million per year of potential funding from the state that would not violate maintenance of effort. Is that number going to be right, whether or not we include, let's say, the opportunity for other funds to be included? What do I mean by other funds? Oil and Gas Commission, Public Service Commission, Water Development, Professional Occupation. It's $1 billion. And those entities did not receive any budget reductions. That would actually make that $45 million go lower because the denominator is increasing. So one minor change in the definition here would substantively change our estimate.
Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Chairman, am I understanding that because those agencies are self-funded, that's the problem or part of the calculation?
Well, Mr. Chairman, unfortunately, it doesn't define, it just says state spending. And if one considers other funds to be part of state spending and recognizing that those entities by and large did not participate in budget reductions, then the average reduction statewide drops, and therefore the maintenance of effort is increased.
Okay. So there's quite a bit of uncertainty. And one of the advantages of the Barlow Amendment is it enables us to go right down to the ceiling, whatever the ceiling proves to be. The question I've got, suppose we do violate it. Suppose it turns out, say we reduced $1 million more than we were supposed to in the maintenance of effort. Is the penalty that $1 million, or is it, you jeopardize the whole thing? What do we know about that sort of thing?
Mr. Chairman, we do not know because they have not indicated. However, what we do have is a look back to see what the Federal Department of Education did under the CARES Act, not the ARP Act, recognizing that was a different administration. And they identified that the sanction could include other federal funds provided to the state. I'm not suggesting that that will be the outcome necessarily of the future. ARP funds.
So it might reach beyond the ARP funds.
Mr. Chairman, that is a possibility.
Do we know when the ARP funds, would it reach just, they said, okay, you were $1 million off, you owe us $1 million back, or they say you owe us the 300 and some million back?
Mr. Chairman, we don't know on that. And when I say reach beyond the ARP funds, I should clarify, I mean reach beyond the ARP funds for K-12, meaning not reaching into federal DEQ money, but other pots within the same act.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Ellis.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Can you tease out, you mentioned the distinction with major maintenance versus construction. Obviously, there's the prohibition on construction. Major maintenance, I just wrote in my notes squishy. It's a little bit more vague. What is our backlog on major maintenance? And have you done more analysis on, is there a possibility to use some of these funds to catch up on the backlog if there is any, and what those amounts might be? I'm just trying to think through possible scenarios.
2 comments, and then I'll turn it over to Mr. Wilmarth. One, for our state purposes, we define major maintenance as part of the general operations of state government. The reason we say that is it is included in the budget bill. It is not included in the capital construction bill. K-12 did not receive any reduction in their major maintenance. As a result, that gives us more leeway under the maintenance of effort if one is to include that factor as opposed to excluding that factor. And then, yes, the funds can be used for major maintenance, and I'll turn that over to Mr. Wilmarth.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ellis, I'm not sure I can answer what the backlog of major maintenance is. I think it will vary by district. But it's about, we allocate approximately $150 million per biennium to school districts.
Okay. Seeing no other questions, I've got one I want to ask Mr. Richards. Education's not the only place where we see these maintenance of effort and federal requirements. Am I right in thinking there's significant ones in the health area as well? And are there ones in other areas?
Mr. Chairman, I would argue that, or I would submit that potentially the K-12 is the most challenging to deal with. Higher education, inclusive of the university and the community colleges, is probably the second most complicated to deal with. Although it appears to us, without further guidance, that your Joint Appropriations Committee, JCC, meets the maintenance of effort requirements in higher education, at least under our calculations without additional guidance. And then third, the Department of Health. And we did meet with the Department of Health, and you will see a forthcoming JCC report that attempts to address maintenance of effort requirements, which are actually a much smaller dollar amount than either higher education or K-12 at this time.
Because I was starting to get concerned that the federal government was putting so many strings on that we had essentially lost control of our spending and taxing in this state. Is that a risk, or is that overblown?
Mr. Chairman, several states have expressed concern, particularly on the revenue side, the taxation prohibitions. In fact, I believe there's been a lawsuit filed on that. The Department of Treasury has provided unofficial guidance and really narrowed the expansive language that appears in the ARP Act to walk that back and indicate that taxation authority is not being limited, but only in specific instances. With respect to the expenditure side, it could be, it could be onerous depending upon what the state desires to do.
Okay, so it sounds to me like we've got to be really careful about some of this as we implement it to try to avoid looking for trouble. Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I might respond to the question from the
Sure.
prior panel, and I'll be 2 minutes here. No, we have not done a formal long-term analysis here. However, and there are a number of reasons for that, not the least of which is we're really bad at picking winners and losers when it comes to which bills will prevail and which ones will not. And there are more than one conflict. The budget bill, which JCC has approved, is in conflict with some provisions in House Bill 173. So we don't like picking winners and losers.
That is interesting. Which provision?
Well, for example, Mr. Chairman, the 1% severance tax. Your JCC on the budget bill has deposited 50% of that into the PMTF, 50% of that into the corpus of the Common School Permanent Land Fund, and no funds into the School Foundation Program. Of course, their action can only apply to 2 fiscal years. This bill applies, well beyond that. But that's just one example. But it makes, $25 million change. The LSRA provision, which conflicts with Senate File 121, is approximately a $50 million change. That being said, setting aside all of those conflicts, I'll try to break things down at a very basic level. Under current CRAG, we believe that there is a $300 million per year shortfall in K-12 education. We believe that is a structural shortfall. We believe that it's roughly $50 million on the capital construction side and $250 million on the operating side. The bill before you only addresses the operating side. The provisions that have been incorporated into House Bill 173 generally address almost all of that $250 million. For example, and I think you have that summary brief before you on your table, and this is something that we're working on to post on the website. Point number 3 illustrates savings from cuts, budget reductions. And it's phased in, but it gets to $50 million a year. So 50 million of that is capital construction. Now we're down, 300 million, 50 million of which is capital construction. So we're left with 250 in the operating side. The first 50 is cuts. The second 50 is addressed through investment income, recognizing that Craig does not project capital gains, and this would come from capital gains. We're not going to get it every year, but historically we've gotten it, 7, 8 out of every 10 years. The next item is with respect to the 1% severance tax, and as Mr. Wilmarth mentioned, that's $20 million growing up to $25 million. So now we've cut that 250 down to 125. If the sales and use tax provision is kicked in at some future point, you get about $90 million. And that's likely to grow over time because sales and use taxes are one of the best inflationary.
I've heard that sales and use tax, okay, but it's a half a penny. So that's assuming a sales and use tax raises 180 million a year.
Correct. And we're only at about 160, 170 million now, but by the time it kicks in, it's about $180 million divided by 2 for 1/2.
Depending on what happens to our economy.
Correct. Okay. If you take all of those, the 50 million on investments, the $50 million in cuts, the $25 million in the 1%, the $90 million on the sales and use tax, you end up with about $35 million. It's probably serendipitous, but that $35 million is in the range of what might be captured from the federal funds. In fact, we think it's a little more than that. So the 250 is generally addressed. Now, that would not be addressed until some future point as when that sales and use tax gets triggered. And I genuinely do not know if that was the goal, was to address the 250, but it was the outcome or rough outcome.
Okay. Excuse me. My understanding was that if this bill didn't pass, and I do need the contrast to explain to the floor what happens if the bill doesn't pass. If this bill doesn't pass, we will eventually, with our structural deficit, run through what's available in the LSRA. And my understanding was that estimate was 4 years out. Is that still the estimate?
Mr. Chairman, it's around fiscal year 2025. So if you count this fiscal year, 21, 22, 23, 24, those 4 years were likely to be good, meaning no violation. What is probably the most interesting thing about that LSRA trigger, it is at any point, the balance drops below $500 million. Well, the balance can drop below $500 million for a lot of reasons. The principal reason being the loan, which is required to cash flow the school foundation program's revenues. We had a loan of this year in $200 million. So we could really hit, say, 699. With the loan, we drop to 499 and we get triggered that there are proportional cuts mandated by the superintendent to all payments of school districts.
Now, my understanding was that those cuts would amount to about 30% of what the school districts get in terms of the model. So if we're roughly were to stay at the current 1.5 billion, that then the cuts would amount to 450 million. Is that a fair reading? Have I missed something?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that $450 million is an expectation that we will not receive capital gains ever. And I think that is perhaps an unlikely scenario, although it is the Craig baseline. If you consider that we will occasionally receive capital gains, then you get back to our number of $250 million of divided, or, that being the numerator, then 1.5 billion being the denominator. So it would be somewhat less.
Okay, so without the capital gains. And anybody can make their own estimates whether we'll get capital gains. And, the stock market is showing all the classic signs of being at the peak of a bubble, but you never know whether that will in fact burst and collapse for a few years or not. It's just not predictable. Anybody who could predict it would be very rich, but nobody's ever been able to. So,
Mr. Chairman, one 30-second response, if I might, on that. 1 year ago, fortunately, in my mind, the State Treasurer's Office was delayed a bit in their reporting. In 1 month, the state of Wyoming experienced $1 billion loss in unrealized capital gains in 1 month.
when that collapse happened, yes, very useful. They went on sale. The stocks did. But they didn't stay on sale very long that time. But that is the kind of risk that there is in the capital gains, clearly.
Mr. Chairman, yes, and it popped back up within 6 weeks or so, and we had gains of $1 billion. It is a very volatile revenue stream.
Yeah, that's why we don't profile. Okay, thank you. That gives me a much better understanding and ability to explain things.
Mr. Chairman.
Andrew Ellis.
Mr. Chairman, I realize that there are a lot of moving parts to this, but on the triggers, as I mentioned, I've got tremendous discomfort with this notion of implementing a sales tax based on what a state has in a certain account. And so I'm curious if we were to remove this section, because we heard, now's not a time, and that's what I wrote in my notes. Now's not the time when we have so much uncertainty of what our markets might look like this summer. The price of oil rebounds, all of these uncertainties. Maybe now's not the time to implement a sales tax, but that's why we've got this for the future in case. And so I am just wondering if we were to remove this and revisit the issue of sales tax in a year, are we going to fall off a cliff? Does that make you nervous, or is this an issue that we can always revisit again, given that the amount that we have in the LSRA right now? And I hope I'm making my point a little clear.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ellis, the option of imposing the sales tax at some future period in this legislation or not is really a policy question. What I will limit my comment to is we have no projection that we will hit the cliff in the next 12 months.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that's my question, because it is when we hit 650, I think that's probably a better way of asking it is, do you think we're going to hit 650 before we reconvene again as a legislature?
Mr. Chairman, we do not anticipate that, and I would even go further to say it's almost impossible for us to hit that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We're going to go to public comment now, and I apologize. I thought that the explanation wouldn't take quite this long, but this thing is so complicated, and the federal stuff is so complicated. We're open to public comment. LSO, how many people do we have in the waiting room?
Mr. Chairman, at this time, 2 people have indicated that they would like to testify. If others would like to testify, can they please raise their virtual hand and they'll be permitted into the room? All right, it looks like 2.
2. Okay, we're going to go to the audience for the first and come back to the waiting room. Who in the audience wants to speak? Anybody? Yes, sir. Identify yourself for the record and proceed.
Mr. Chairman, Rusty Bell, Campbell County Commissioner, representing WCCA today. And I guess our concerns from WCCA actually really fall with probably echo some of the concerns that you guys have already raised on the half-cent sales tax and when that would be implemented and the impacts that would have to the ability to local governments, counties and cities, municipalities to implement their optional taxes. Anytime there's a potential increase in a sales tax, that makes it more difficult for municipalities and counties to to implement our own optional taxes. And as you know, or maybe not know, 21 of the 23 counties have a 5th cent. There was a bill that was somewhat attached to this, House Bill 174, that WCCA and the WSBA and WHAM worked out to, if 173 passed, that the 5th cent would become permanent, protecting that option that we have. That bill was killed, and so here we are in somewhat of an opposition to not necessarily the bill itself, but certainly to the 1/2 cent sales tax, and to Senator Ellis's points of not knowing when this is going to be implemented, when it's going to be taken off. If a municipality or a county has something on the ballot or potentially going on the ballot, and then all of a sudden this kicks in, it really does have an impact on whether that would pass or not. So I would be amiss, or WCCA would be amiss, if we didn't at least raise the question on the 1/2 cent sales tax and the impact it has on, potential impact it has on our abilities to do the things we do. So appreciate that. I would stand for any questions. Thank you.
Senator Ellis.
Mr. Chairman, to your point, I guess I'm just thinking about a situation where you're asking voters, we'll go from 4 to 5 or whatever that number is. And then if this kicks in, then whatever's printed on the ballot, that could be different. Or I'm just trying to think through some of those difficulties. Is that a concern of yours?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ellis, it is. And I would just let you know that I know at no time there is certainly a threshold in Wyoming, in the counties, of what people will accept as a sales tax. Nobody's ever gone over 6 cents. So, there is a threshold that it's going to be tough to overcome. And if we have a water project, or we have, any kind of, really anything, if you already have an option in there, doing any of those special things, special taxes, it's going to be difficult. So anyway, we raise that concern.
Okay.
Thank you.
I think you're talking to a sympathetic audience that understands your concern, but it's good to hear from you directly.
Appreciate it.
So
Thank you.
appreciate that. Thank you. LSO, do I see somebody from the State Department of Education in the waiting room?
No, not to my knowledge, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
You do have 3 people though.
Okay. Pick one of them. Let's go first there.
Mr. Noble with the Department of Revenue.
Okay.
Morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Dan Noble. I'm the Director of the Department of Revenue. Our testimony associated with the bill before you is associated with administrative impacts. One of the things that we are good at is distributing money based on large numbers of tax returns. The issue associated with that is it comes with a cost. When we have to change those distributions, there are 2 components of what we need to address, and one of them is time, and the other one is money. The systems that we have before us, the excise tax system and the mineral tax system, would both be impacted by this, albeit the sales tax component of this, it would be something that would happen obviously in the future. Based on the way the bill's drafted. But the mineral severance tax will change our distribution model. It will change the reporting associated with this. And I think it's important that we recognize that will come at a cost. We did not receive a fiscal note request on this bill, which is why you don't already have this. But it is something that we would certainly like to weigh in on and provide some level of a time frame to be able to implement this, as well as the associated costs associated with it. And for that, Mr. Chairman, I'll stand for any questions.
Do you have a dollar estimate at this point?
Mr. Chairman, on a similar type bill that we were working on, we received a request from the vendor that we utilize of about 170 million, 170,000, and it would take them 6 to 8 months in order to implement the changes necessary. And that would be for the MTS system. The there'd be a like amount for the sales tax associated with this. It doesn't require a form change, but it does require reporting changes, distribution changes, and the amount that that goes to different sectors. So the reports would change. It would be really important to ensure that you're talking about 45,000 vendors that we're dealing with here, ensuring that they have adequate notice. We require 90 days notice to implement a tax change, and it can only begin on a calendar quarter. So we could make that happen, but just recognize that there will be some administrative costs, and it's roughly 170,000 for each different system, and probably 6 to 8 months to get it up and going.
Okay, thank you. That's useful to know. Any questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is there anybody else here that wants to testify? Yes, sir, in the back. Candy Carey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Ken DeCaria, Wyoming School Boards Association. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to speak in support of this piece of legislation. One thing, Mr. Chairman, this is probably one of the most creative solutions I've seen in order to fix this. And I've sat through a lot of meetings for the past 20 years on school funding, Mr. Chairman. And, you know, I know the time and effort and the work that's involved. And I'd be remiss if I didn't thank everyone for the time and effort that's gone into this, because believe me, I know how much that's asked out of people in order to do that. Mr. Chairman, I would also say this is our best option going forward of everything that's been placed out there. And so I would encourage that this is the piece of legislation that moves forward. Mr. Chairman, for one thing, it's a total solution. And it follows what was in the white paper. And when this all started to come out as far as looking at a structural deficit moving forward, you know, there was a committee that was set up in order to look at what would be the solution to funding. And as you know, Mr. Chairman, there are 5 parts to that. And this, I think, really addresses all 5 of those parts that were in that solution in order to fix this. You know, Mr. Chairman, for one thing, it does have a new revenue in there, and that's been the one piece that's been missing out of those 5 pieces in that white paper. But Mr. Chairman, I think the other part is it's a very good way and a creative way of using those federal funds in order to help out with this deficit. So, Mr. Chairman, we would be supportive of this piece of legislation, and I'm happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just briefly, just looking at the taxation rate for the sales tax, would your organization support it if we removed the turn off and turn off switch and just had it effective July 1st, 2021?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ellis, well, I don't think that's necessarily the biggest piece in this one, but at some point, I think that's one of those pieces that has to be looked at moving forward. If you have a structural deficit, you're going to have to figure out how you're going to, you know, come up with that. But at this point in time, Mr. Chairman, I think we would still be supportive because it takes care of some of those pieces moving forward. But Mr. Chairman and Senator Ellis, I think that's a piece that has to be looked at some point going forward, is how this is going to, you know, that piece is going to come into play. And I've heard for a long time, Mr. Chairman, that legislature will address that issue, but, you know, I haven't seen it so far. I've seen the willingness to do the cuts, but not the willingness to bring those revenue streams forward.
Okay, thank you very much. LSO, who's next in the waiting room?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Shad Hamilton, if you'd please turn your video and microphone on.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Senate committee members. I'm Shad Hamilton. I'm a principal at Horizon High School in Evanston, Wyoming, and I also represent the Wyoming Association of Secondary School Principals. an organization with 160 plus members, most of the secondary school principals in the state of Wyoming. And I'll speak briefly on their behalf, but first I want to just thank Mr. Scott for allowing public testimony. I've sent you all some of our emails over the last month, I guess, few weeks on this issue. I've kind of watched House Bill 173 progress with the association, and I think we can say that we support it. There is a huge need for a stable revenue stream for education. And I think this bill, through a lot of compromising and effort, starts to establish that. And I think that's very important. I think it's really important for folks to understand that in the last 5 years, school districts have made cuts every year. We cut through attrition every year. My school in Evanston, when I started 5 years ago, sorry, my bell's going off. When I started 5 years ago, we had 10 staff members. We're a small school, an alt school. I'm down to 6. My building budget's gone from 50,000 to 10,000. We're making those cuts in part because of what was imposed on us a couple years ago. We had to cut our budget by 3% when we started messing with the school funding model 3 years ago. So we're at a point right now and talking with our members, some members just yesterday, there are districts, time is kind of the essence here too. There are a number of districts out there waiting to see what the cuts are going to be. School districts have prepared, I think, to make cuts across the board is what I'm hearing. But if those cuts are deeper than $100 million, we're talking significant cuts in staffing. And you have districts out there right now that are waiting to hire teachers and principals because they don't know what their budgets are going to be next year. And the longer we wait, the best folks move on, they find jobs elsewhere. And when you're talking about reducing principals and teachers, classroom teachers, in April or May, it gives you very little time to prepare. And it has a huge impact on students and their schedules and education in general. And that's what I'm hearing from my principals across the state that I represent. So just know, that we're out there, we're watching, and it's very important what you guys do with this bill, and that we support this bill without any amendments. As it is, we support it, and appreciate your work and allowing me to testify. If you have any questions, I'm happy to entertain those.
Very briefly, we're on time trouble.
Mr. Chairman, same question as that I asked before. Would you support removing the turn on, turn off switch for the tax and making it become effective July 1st? And is that your organization's position or just your personal thought?
No, my organization supports a stable revenue stream. And I think like the other one that testified, I've heard over and over again for 2 years now that we need a revenue stream. And if that's taxes, if you talk to educators, if you talk to our principal group, 100% support on that front. We're all from Wyoming. I'm a 4th generation Wyomingite. None of us are crazy about taxes, but when it comes to cutting teachers, programs, activities, really changing the face of the school, are we willing to chip in and pay? Yeah. And I think it's important to note that education makes up, by the time you count the teachers, the staffing, the students, we're about a quarter of the entire state's population. And my work the last couple of years sure points at the fact that I think you have about a quarter of the state's population just connected with education that will support a revenue stream option like the penny tax. Ask Mr. Harshman how high the stack of papers are on his desk for the penny tax. You'll hear the same thing.
Okay, thank you very much. LSO is that exhaust the waiting room or is somebody else?
Yes, we have Miss Diana Clapp. If she can please turn her video and audio on.
Briefly, because we're running out of time.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I will be very brief. Diana Clapp, Coordinator for the State Board of Education. And the brief comment that I would like to make is specifically to the section six that references the State Board conducting the study on the reorganization of school districts with the due date of October 30th, 2021. I want to be very clear that I have not spoken with the full board, but have visited with the vice chair and wanted to share with you a concern regarding that due date and the capacity of the board to be able to provide for you a quality report in that time frame, particularly given the summer months of the school year.
Okay. Fair enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We'll proceed. We have somebody. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman,
Delancey.
members of the committee. My name's Cindy Delancey with the Wyoming Business Alliance. My comments will be very brief as I know that you are short on time this morning. I encourage the committee, Mr. Chairman, to heed the warning from Ms. Clapp. The State Board does have a full boat right now with their profile of graduate efforts. I share the same concerns as Senator Ellis as far as maybe evaluating if the State Board in isolation is really the right governmental entity to take on such a voluminous topic, and maybe bringing in other additional agencies for collaboration and support could make sure that we ensure some objectivity into the analysis. We also would encourage the legislature in whole to continue this discussion about seeking efficiencies. We spent a lot of time in these meeting rooms talking about cuts and talking about revenue increases. As business owners and leaders, we're constantly pushing ourselves to figure out ways that we can maximize our investments and get the best returns. We've not done that in the context of K-12 education. We've done that in the context of governmental operations with the efficiency study, and we encourage that this conversation continue at some point when the time is right to look at efficiencies that could be examined within the K-12 system, much like what we did with governmental operations. And then finally, in conclusion, the half cent doesn't sound like much, but it can really add up. And as far as Senator Ellis's point about certainty within business, when you're buying millions of dollars of supplies or items that can be taxable, to have a start and a stop date would be very, very helpful as those businesses' decisions are made. So with that in mind, I offer those comments as this conversation continues. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Anybody else here? Anybody else here? Yes, ma'am, very quickly. We are about out of time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Janine Bayteski. I'm the past president of Wyoming School Boards Association. I'm a trustee in Teton County. I just wanted to directly answer Senator Ellis's question. In November, we have our delegate assembly. We had a resolution come forward with a 1 penny sales tax on it, and 80% of our members voted in favor of it. My local school board voted 100%. All 7 of us supported it.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, we're out of time. The plan going forward is we'll work the bill Monday morning. We would like to finish our work Monday morning. Committee, I may, if we get hung up Monday morning, we'll look for a time we can meet on an irregular basis outside our normal times. But we need to get, we're under the kind of time pressure you normally see with the budget session. So we need to get a bill to the floor. We're adjourned, and committee, before you leave today, I want to talk and make sure we understand what we're doing preparing for Monday so that we have something to work with.